Okay, welcome to the first faculty colloquium of the year. And I know it was the custom last year to feature faculty who are newer in their careers, feature their research, but we kind of broke from that custom this year because of really a very exciting project that has come to fruition, and we wanted to feature it. And I have to say that this is a book that's on on the coffee table in my office, and I use it as a reference a lot because it's a great just tutorial for me on the museum, but it's a great read, and I would encourage you from the standpoint of just, on your top 10 things to read, put this on that list. And I'm going to leave the specifics to Tracy to talk about, but I have to say that the When Modern Was Contemporary is a book that is a beautiful book. First of all, it's just extraordinarily well done, and it's been a work in progress for 5 years. 5 years, huh? I'll never get back. So please welcome to the first faculty colloquium, and please welcome Tracy Fitzpatrick to the
Hi, thanks so much for coming. I joke I'll never get back, but really it was an extraordinary experience to work on this book. I want to thank Barry. I want to thank Suzanne. Suzanne, I saw you. I don't see you now, but you're here. Oh, Suzanne, sorry. Thank you for letting the museum hijack the first colloquia for the catalog. I just thought since faculty members worked on this project, it would really be a great opportunity in this forum for them to present some of their research on objects that they wrote about for the catalog. As I said, I joke about not getting the 5 years back, and I confess that when I started working on this project in 2009, even though I had worked with the modern collection here for 5 years already at that time, I sort of thought, I don't know what this project is going to be. It feels a little bit like a vanity publication for the museum, and it really turned out to be so much more. I know now I had no real understanding of the collection within the context of Roy Neuberger. He was truly one of the most important philanthropists, collectors, and advocates of the arts of his time. I think one of the reasons that he's less well known than some of his peers is that we tend to evaluate one's legacy after they're gone. And he lived for such a long time. He died December 2010 at the age of 107. And so we're really only at the point of truly looking at his life and what he did. Another reason is his papers, the Roy R. Neuberger papers, are all upstairs on the 3rd floor. They're not accessible to the public. And one of my goals is, when the museum's ready, to release those papers to the Archives of American Art so they can be used by scholars in the future, because I think they really hold a wealth of material for people working on this 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s moment in the development of modern art in the United States. So just very, very briefly about Roy, and I'm going to speak very quickly so we can devote most of the time to the faculty members who worked on objects for the catalog. He was not born into an art collecting family. He was orphaned by age 13. He dropped out of the NYU School of Journalism in 1923. He went to work for the B. Altman department store, the flagship store down in Manhattan. And that store was really important to him. B. Altman was known for its customer service and for developing this very loyal following of customers. And those lessons he took with him throughout his life in business. The other thing that he did while he was there was he socialized with colleagues who were involved in the arts in one way or another. So these were people who took him to museums, to galleries for the first time, concerts, and it was through that experience that he decided, even taking art classes, and he had a brief flirtation with thinking he might be an artist, very brief. It was through that experience that he wound up in Paris in the 1920s. When he was in Paris, he did, I know, it's great. He did what we art historians, right, my fellow art historians here, what we try to teach our students to do, which is learn to look, to use your eyes, to look at art, to train yourself, right, to look really even before you start to think in a way. And this is something he did going to museums. He spent a lot of time at the Louvre in particular. And I would say it's probably one of the skills that he developed that served him best in everything that he did throughout his career. While he was there, he stumbled across the story of Vincent van Gogh, who in the 1920s, even though his work was unsaleable during his lifetime, in the 1920s, his work was seeing 5 figures. There was a kind of Van Gogh craze. There's a sort of like a myth that somehow that Roy kind of, I don't know, didn't discover Van Gogh, but sort of, you know, came upon Van Gogh. Well, Van Gogh, there was a rage at the time about Van Gogh. There were lots of forgeries on the market at that time. The influence of the story of Van Gogh is the thing, though, that inspired him to support contemporary artists. So he came back to New York in 1929 and wound up on Wall Street that spring. He took a job at a firm called Halley Stieglitz as a runner, so he was bringing trades, delivering orders to the trading floor. He was making $15 a week. And when the crash hit just months after he got there, because he was just a runner, he was only managing his own money. And he did he developed an instrument for himself, even at an early age, what we now call hedging. So and it's an instrument, a protective instrument that he used throughout his life. And what he did is when one security lost value, he sold the same number of dollars short of another security, right? So he was balancing out his portfolio, and when the crash hit, he came out even. He wrote that many people much older and wiser than he obviously suffered terrible, terrible losses. But at a time when a lot of young men his age were just having to rebuild their lives, he, in the early 30s, got married, started a family, and started buying art. He started buying art very, very cautiously, 1937. His first purchases were a painting by a pretty unknown artist named Guy McCoy and a drawing by William Gropper, well known today. And the two pieces, when you look at them, are kind of unremarkable visually, but in combination with one another, there's some seats up here there are 4 seats right here if people in the back want to sit down at some point. In combination with one another, they actually embody 2 key ideologies that he adopted and continued to use throughout his collecting, which was, number 1, to support contemporary artists and people who supported them, and number 2, to buy work by artists who he felt had something strong to say through their art. He was, his work, and this is a photo, I'm sorry it's a little blurry, these old photos it looks nicer when it's smaller. Neuberger Berman, about 1953, that's Roy in the center. This is the ticker tape, what it used to look like, and you can see the paintings over on the right-hand side. That's our Stuart Davis, Barbershop, Mars and Hartley's Fisherman's Last Supper. That's a piece by Lee Gatch and a Ralston Crawford. Oh, who did that? I was going to No, it's okay. Okay, you can leave it up here. Okay, thank you. Actually, the first public display of Roy's collection was in Neuberger Berman. Not in a museum, not in a gallery, but in the offices. And he actually had the Neuberger Berman offices specially designed so that he could display work on these hanging devices, and there was lighting installed specific to paintings, to displaying paintings and sculpture, which was almost unheard of at the time and really led toward, in many ways, he was kind of a precursor. This isn't a corporate art collection, it was his collection, but a precursor of the display of corporate art collections. He was not only a smart and avid collector, he was a generous donor. Prior to the founding of the Neuberger Museum of Art, he gave hundreds of works away to museums, both large and small, across the country. And I'm just showing you this Jacob Lawrence, The War series, which Roy bought in its entirety, the whole series, and donated to the Whitney in the late 40s. Not to us, because we didn't exist yet, but I would have been happy to have this here. He gave purchase funds to museums such as the Metropolitan and the Museum of Modern Art for the acquisition of contemporary art, and he also loaned his collection very generously. He was also an advocate for public support of the arts, particularly through his work as president of the American Federation from the late 50s through to the late 60s. When the Neuberger was founded in 1969, it was given a core group of objects by Roy, and today that collection, which is about 950 objects now, a little over a tenth of the total collection of the Neuberger, is really the core of the institution. And museums, including the Neuberger, that we are obligated to be very thorough in the investigation of provenance and exhibition histories around any object that we take into the collection. But when a museum is established by a founding donor, things are a little more complicated and different. Take, the Neuberger as an example. The Phillips collection in Washington, D.C. is another example. And so you have to do a little bit of catch-up because you don't have all the information about the objects that you might have had if they were coming in from other donors, sort of case by case. And that's what we've done here with the catalog project, using Roy's papers, using other relevant resources, relying on scholars in the field. And so what I've done today is we've invited 4 faculty members who worked on the project. I want to recognize Sarah Warren, who also worked on the project, but who, because she has an exhibition on view right now, was extremely grateful not to be invited to. I mean, I invited her, but she was relieved when I kind of said, you don't really want to do this. And she said, no, I'm busy. I've got enough to do right now with the show. So Sarah is another writer for the catalog. We're going to start out with Julian Kreimer, who is going to talk about Stanton McDonald Wright's 1912 portrait of John Giacoppoli. And I'm going to put your presentation up. And please welcome Julian.
Push forward. Okay. Hi. I should also say, just for those who are curious, and I was interested because this is the first time I was writing I usually write for art magazines and art criticism, so this was the first time that I embarked on a project like this. And Tracy sent a few images, and she said, choose 2 of these 4, if that sounds good. And I chose this one, and I didn't really know much about McDonald Wright. I'd sort of heard of the synchromists, and in Art 101, there's the idea of all these competing early movements that are trying to, with the vorticists and the synchromists and the futurists, all the less famous ists, basically. And so I thought, well, sure, this sounds like an interesting sort of cul-de-sac. And it actually, what I quickly realized is it's, when you're working with something that's less well known, what was interesting was to sort of go down the rabbit hole. It turns out McDonald Wright was a total scoundrel. He painted, and what was really interesting, Michael offered very generously the laser pointer, and I realized mostly what I was interested in was less the painting itself, which is fine. I mean, it's a good painting. but it's actually a very small portion of a much larger original. But it was more the gossip about this crazy guy who painted this about the age of a senior. I think he was 20, in fact, he was 22 when he painted it. So it was actually very interesting. That was one of the first, obviously things that cropped up. I did the math. He was born in 1890. This was painted in 1912. And I thought, or 13. The dates with him, because he wrote a lot of he tended to backdate things to say he was the first of something. So, he was either 22 or 23, but he was about the age of our seniors. So the whole time I was researching this, I kept finding these sort of insane things. He was from a very pretty well-to-do family from Charlottesville, Virginia. He moved as a young boy to, my caveat is that basically I was really interested in the gossip about him. So I apologize, it's not, it's not the stuff I usually write, but it is fascinating to see how one of these kind of early modernist figures, just how it was really almost like today with media companies or web companies, the way they're trying to insinuate themselves as the leading figure in, say, we shrink your data better than anybody. So we take reality and sort of abstract it better than anybody was his thing. In fact, so much so, I'll give you the little bio in a second, but he was a very good writer, which helped, and he was living in London with his brother for a few months after this early period. And his brother has a different name, and so it seemed less suspicious. But his brother wrote a book under his name, Willard Huntington Wright, and the book is called Modern Painting, Its Tendency and Meaning. It came out in 1915, so it was pretty early in the whole early modernist thing. It was really meant to be one of the first English language kind of textbooks of modern art. And he gave, now it turns out MacDonald Wright himself, Stanton, wrote most of the book. And because their last names are different, nobody really noticed that the Wright is the same, but everything else was different about the name. And just to give you a sense, MacDonald Wright started, and he does have credit as founding the first American sort of self-consciously modern art movement that declared itself modern. All the other American artists who would go to France would kind of fall into the old-fashioned 19th century, wanted to kind of associate themselves with the establishment. MacDonald Wright was unusual in that he really did try to stamp the first one with a very poor Pennsylvania painter who was probably more talented but less of a PR genius, named Morgan Russell. So the movement, they stamped it the synchromists, a word that had been used by here and there by a couple other painters, but they really, and there's a lot of debate because there's this French and Russian couple, the Delaunay's, who used it in a poster, seeing Kromm, a year earlier than they did. And they actually got in a fist fight at a bar about it with, and I think the Americans were roundly defeated by the French and the Russian painter. So, but the thing that was amazing was I actually found the book at the Metropolitan in the library. They have a copy of this very old 1915 art textbook. And they give synchromism, let me see the exact number. They gave themselves a 28-page chapter. They gave another chapter called Picasso and Cubism, got 25 pages. And Orphism, which was this competing style that was very similar, and I'll just show you, let me see if I can. This is his kind of fully mature synchromist painting. There's his, let me just go back for a second. There's his brother, painted by him, with his collection of books right around the time he's working on the book in London. This I'll jump back to. This is the subject of our painting. But where is the, okay, sorry. Anyway, the Orphic painting by Delaunay it was shoehorned into the Picasso and Cubism chapter, didn't get its own. And Kandinsky was discussed in 8 pages in a chapter that title was called The Lesser Moderns. It was kind of great. Anyway, so MacDonald Wright, to go back a second, moved to Paris very young. He was actually, I think, 18 when he moved to Paris. He married a very well-to-do Wisconsin. He had run out of money. When he was a teenager, he hopped on a boat to Nagasaki as a 13-year-old. He ran away, or 14-year-old, excuse me. He ran away, signed up as a cabin boy and a windjammer for Nagasaki. But his father got wind of this and hired some Pinkerton detectives who caught up with the windjammer in Honolulu, and they dragged him back to Santa Monica, where his father owned a hotel. He managed to marry a very well-to-do Wisconsin woman named Ida Wyman, who was 10 years older than him. She and her mother lived with him in an apartment in Paris, and they traveled around Europe going to art galleries. I think they left the mother-in-law in Paris while they went around. And when he came back, I mean, what was sort of mind-boggling as I was researching this is that, I was thinking of, here's somebody my student's age who's kind of going on these kind of Keystone Cops early modernist art adventures. But he did study with this Canadian, very interesting Canadian teacher in Paris, and he met Morgan Russell there, and he had this idea that was very much in the air that music is the correct metaphor for how painting should function, that a painting, rather than being a representation of, as we all know, ordinary mimetic reality as seen by the eye, it should be a kind of symphony of different tones and harmonies. So the colors, so actually they, MacDonald Wright, he also took credit, and this was actually handwritten in a letter that was at the Metropolitan when I was doing the research. I came upon in his papers this letter that he'd written to probably one of the most well-known colorists, along with Joseph Albers, Faber Biren. And in the letter which he wrote to Biren had requested a copy of MacDonald Wright's color treatise that was very hard to find. And he wrote in this accompanying letter, he said, and again, this self-aggrandizement is pretty great. I may have been the idiot inventor of the circular discs that all the paint companies used afterwards. I don't know, end quote. But he had this idea, and I don't know if you can tell from the right, and again, apologies about the blurry image, but the cutouts, and maybe I will use the laser pointer, these little shapes are cutouts, and this is the white is a second piece that would be put on top of the first piece, and you would actually have these cutouts, and so they would almost be like certain finger formations on the piano, so that the sequence, the distance from the colors, if you turn the colors into 12, there's 3 primaries, and so it's easy to divide them, multiply them by 4, to get 12. So you have the 12-tone harmonic scale or in music, and you have the 12-tone color scale. And so you have these chords depending on what effect you want. And so the chords he would use to sort of push the eye forward in areas that jut out, pull the eye in areas that recede. And you could, he was deeply influenced by Cézanne. And another, I didn't bring a slide, but you can all picture Jackson Pollock. Pollock's teacher, Thomas Hart Benton, was always into these bumps and hollows. And Benton was the third member of synchromism who was kicked out. Stanton MacDonald Wright chose Russell over Benton as the co-founder of this movement. So Benton actually, who's known for these farm scenes with lots of rolling hills in the Midwest, got that rolling from this synchronous style. He literally was kicked out of the apartment with Stanton and Morgan and moved back to the States. But a lot of, in fact, he wrote about Stanton. He still respected him and said he called Stanton Wright the most gifted all-around fellow I ever knew. And he ended up, a lot of those ideas got into Pollock's paintings. So this movement, for all that it's sort of absurd and, self-inflated, did have, in a weird way, totally unintentionally, an enormous influence on modernism. I guess I'll just, for all my making fun, there's two more things I'll say about the painting, because I want to leave time for everybody else. One of the things that MacDonald Wright was very interested in was the sense that, and this is, the sense that the painting should have what he called, being from California, having experience in Asia, he was interested in Japanese aesthetics, and particularly this idea of yugen, which was this idea of interior realism. And to quote him, what is called yugen by the Japanese, there's a sense of reality which cannot be seen, but which is evident by feeling. This quality can be created neither by intellectual means nor by the will. It is necessary that the artist be taken over by an all-encompassing idea. End quote. So this very kind of Japanese idea of an internal reality that connects to how we think about music was very important and I think that also connects to Cézanne, sort of the idea that almost the painting wills itself through an unconscious kind of interior reality, a painting of a subjective reality. The subject, John Dracopoli, met Stanton MacDonald Wright in Antibes, where he had a house, and MacDonald Wright was rooming with Lee Simonson, I think was his name, who was became a very significant theater designer. You showed the Marsden Hartley. Marsden Hartley tried to be roommates with them in France that summer, and Stanton Macdonald Wright kicked him out of the house and said, "No way." I think, and Macdonald Wright was a product of his time. I mean, sadly enough, he has some pretty unpleasant things to say about, he was a well-to-do Californian right-wing guy. Later in life, he became part of the WPA, and part of his job was ferreting out any kind of red influence in WPA paintings in California. So the WPA in California was much more right-wing than it was in New York. But Dracopoli met him in Antibes as they were 19, I think, and they were summering in the same city, and he became a great buyer of Synchronist paintings. In fact, most of the Synchronist paintings by Macdonald Wright and Morgan Russell went into the Dracopoli collection. He moved to the States, then back to England. His family had a lot of land in France. He eventually retired to the English countryside with his synchronist painting collection, and started his book collection, grew and grew, and pushed the paintings to the attic. And as he put it, in a fit of housekeeping, he decided he needed more room for the books, and he burned most of the synchronist paintings. So the painting that the Neuberger has is just this tiny little head that was cut out of a much bigger life-size portrait of Dracopoli, and Macdonald Wright cut it down so that he could bring it back to the States when he moved back from Paris. And so it's a particularly significant work, not so much because of its aesthetic qualities, but because it's really one of the only existing works of the early synchronist period that we have of this first American modern art movement. So there it is.
Thanks, Julian. Next up, we have Jane Kromm, and she is going to talk about Lionel Feineger's High Houses number 2. Jane?
Okay, so the painting I worked on, Lionel Feineger's High Houses number 2. Here you see it in its entirety. And I was really happy to be working on this particular painting because when I was in high school, I really liked the Bauhaus and all the Bauhaus artists. But then when I went on to college and thereafter, I got drawn in other directions, and I never got to keep working on the artists of that period that I liked so much. So the 2 artists I worked on for the catalog were Josef Halpers and then also Lionel Feineger. So High Houses 2 is one of several paintings that he did with this title, or nearly this title, over quite a long period of time, actually starting from this era, and then continuing on actually until the 1950s. So he kept with it all his life. And it's a transitional painting given some of the basic standard issues that we associate with his art. So it's a kind of a cubist treatment of an architectural subject with a few human figures there in the foreground. There's some trees and a bunch of houses. So that's the basic painting that I was assigned to work on. So first I thought, well, what do I know about Feininger these days? And since I knew him mainly in his Bauhaus orientation, what else is interesting about him? Now, he has a very German name, and he spent a lot of time in Germany. He's from a German family, but he was born in New York, and so he's considered an American artist. And his first few years, of course, were spent here in the States, and then he went over to Germany to pursue his education. The works he's known for in the earlier part of his career, just to give you a sense, he was a great cartoonist, mostly for the Chicago Herald Tribune, or Sunday Tribune, but for a few other papers where he introduced the Kinder Kids. And I'm from a German family too, and I actually knew the Kinder Kids from when I was growing up, so that was kind of fun to hear about that. And they are all very politically incorrect ethnic stereotypes, and that's Feininger himself as the kind of puppet meister there. His early painting continues some of the playfulness, cartoonish-like elements of that earlier work, and this is called Green Bridge from 1909. So he's always on an architectural scheme and framing the scene in interesting ways, and then having passersby kind of lost in their own world, rambling by, sometimes hurrying by, and many of them are quite cartoonish with funny hats and heads. And these are called his Biedermeier figures because they refer to kind of a cozy, comical, imaginary set of figures that were well known in German art through the 19th century. So that's his early work, but then by the end of the teens, he moves closer to what he's really famous for, a more purely cubist approach to architectural subjects. So this is his design for the Bauhaus Manifesto, and the image is always referred to as the Cathedral of Socialism because it does have that, it's a Gothic structure fractured in the appropriate cubist way with the tenants of the Bauhaus on the other side. And then the light bursting against and around the different architectural forms, kind of crystallizing. So that was one of the earliest images to set, the Bauhaus agenda. Then throughout the rest of his career, he continued with that type of a format. This is Gelmerode from 1929, and he did a series based on churches and particular countryside places in Germany, working out this light crossing and slicing and sluicing through all the different elements of different kinds of architectural structures. So that's really what he's famous for. And then he had a very long career back in the United States, in the New Haven area, continuing some of these same issues. At the Bauhaus, he was the master of the printmaking workshop, so he handled all the printmaking issues. Okay, so I have a sense of his background, and now I'm coming back to look at the image and see what I think about it. And very interestingly, there's a drawing that we have in the collection associated with the painting. And it was, as you can see, it was sent from Lionel Feininger to Marie Neuberger with cordial greetings because it was going to be part of the birthday book celebration for Roy Neuberger, and all the artists in the collection were approached and asked if they would like to give him something as part of this birthday book. And they gave him all sorts of things, but here we really lucked out because we got the, preparatory or kind of preliminary image for the painting itself. It's from a little notebook. It's dated Paris. It's March and 1908. And it shows a scene very similar, not exactly identical to the painting, but certainly very close to it. And there was a letter that came along with it as well. So that was really interesting to see. Feininger called these sketches his nature notes. And they are dispersed all over the world. So the Busch-Reisinger has 3 of them from April of the same location, and I'm currently looking for some of the others because he spent quite a lot of time working at this particular location. Many of the early writers about the image talk about him as obsessed with the speed of modernity and the New York sky line and loving skyscrapers and things like that. And I sort of thought, that's not a skyscraper. There are some interesting things about the way it looks, and you know what? That's not it. First of all, there are like too many chimneys. And then the whole silhouette of the building is wrong. It's earlier because they're wider at the bottom and they kind of move in a little bit towards the top. And then there are these strange patterns and sort of diagonal sections there. So I was interested in all those things, and actually, thanks to Julian, I was working with a book, which I still have not given back to him. So I have to buy him a new one. And it's a book of photographs by Eugène Atget, who I was working on for a couple of other reasons. One is that I teach 19th century photography now, and the other is because, my very famous almshouse project that I've been working on for ages, I am often studying 19th century photographers because I'm looking for things that are gone now. So the really old photographs are the things that I need. So here is Bernice Abbott's photograph of Atget himself, and a photograph up here of Atget reflected in the window of the storefront that he's photographing, because he used very out-of-date equipment in this time period, so he took very long exposures with a camera where he used the cap on the lens to time the exposure. And then he printed everything out as contact prints the next summer with his wife out in the sunlight. So it was a very long, laborious kind of a project. But one of the things that he worked on were scenes of the various neighborhoods in Paris. And it really struck in my mind that there was a similarity here. And these are two views of a street in Paris called the Rue Saint-Jacques. It is the beginning of the pilgrimage route in Paris on the way to Santiago de Compostela. So it's a very old street and very important street filled with a lot of interesting things. It's got a number of churches adjacent to it. One of them is the Church of Saint-Séverin. And oddly enough, these wonderful Gothic churches were encroached periodically over the centuries with all kinds of very junky architecture, stores, sheds, things like that. So part of this renovation was to extend the street, widen it, expand the street and widen it. So the old 17th century buildings were going to be taken down to widen the street, and then structures that were encroaching on the important buildings like these churches were being removed. And so some of the other things to notice here before I move on, or wait, maybe I have... Yes, okay, so I have them paired up in this way. I'm kind of looking at that sort of telltale silhouette and the scaffolding and the staining and the various kinds of patchy marks on the sides of the buildings, which seem to add interest and pattern and subdivisional potential to the artist in his painting. Now, some of these things are in the drawing, but not all of them. And like I say, this is one drawing of a whole bunch of them, but you can see something that seems to resemble the sorts of scaffolding that you see over here, kind of propping these buildings up. So I thought, well, this is really pretty interesting, because if you are in the process of subjecting structures to a cubist analysis, normally you have, the structure itself, you have the fenestration, you have the roof line, you have the edges. That's pretty much what you have to work with. But if you're doing a demolition, you've got so much more going on, all the scarring and the scaffolding. And this adds to your potential battery of visual stuff to work with quite a lot more. And so that is what is added into this painting. Now, it turns out, that Lionel Feininger is on the Rue Saint-Jacques in March 1908, and also April 1908, at least as far as I know. These photographs by Atget are February 1908, so this is pretty much what the street looks like. The letter that accompanies this drawing, when it was sent to Marie, Neuberger says, this is the Rue Saint-Jacques. In 1913, a letter he sends to his wife says that this painting is about a demolition on a street in Paris. So, you put all these things together and you get a sense of a lot of activity on the Rue Saint-Jacques in this time period. Here is a print, one of 5 different proofs, of which it seems no edition was ever made, and these are all called the Rue Saint-Jacques. So it's quite an interesting body of work. Now, Feininger is there, Atget is there, and Robert Delaunay is there as well, because his images of the Church of Saint-Séverin, which you see here, are from just a little bit earlier. They're from the same time as the drawing and the photos, from around 1908 to 1909. So as far as I'm concerned, there's a crowd of artists out there on the Rue Saint-Jacques at all hours of the day, and that's what I plan to work on next. So it was great fun to work on this. So.
Thanks so much, Jane. Next up is Jen Hyacinthe, and she is going to talk about Romare Bearden's melon season. Oops, okay.
So I've entitled my talk Simultaneity and the Conjure Woman, Romare Bearden's Melon Season, 1967 of the Neuberger. In 1968, Ralph Ellison wrote an essay included in the exhibition catalog for a show of Romare Bearden's work at the State University of New York in Albany, November 25th through December 22nd. The essay was reprinted in an issue of the Massachusetts Review Journal, whose cover was designed by Bearden. And you see that here. Ellison asserted that Bearden recollected and maintained the vitality of his memories of childhood in North Carolina and of coming of age in the North in his artworks by, quote, reducing them to artistic style, end quote. A style demonstrating the painter's deep expertise in remaking the painting traditions of Europe and Africa that came before him. To Ellison, Bearden's process culminated in the, quote, creation of fresh methods to explore the plastic possibilities of the Negro experience, end quote. In so doing, Bearden, by various abstract visual means, addressed narratives of and social inequities faced by Black people in America in the mid-20th century, without the limits inherent to social realist painting. Ralph Ellison and his wife Fanny were collectors of Bearden's work, and this is one they owned, entitled Gray Interior of 1967. As Ellison noted, Bearden brought a, quote, new visual order into the world, resetting society's clock with his own method of defining the times. Bearden merged the formats of art history masters with various dynamics of Black abstraction. And for this discussion, I'm focusing upon the metaphor of conjuring in the Neuberger mixed media work Melon Season of 1967. Conjuring was one means Bearden employed to bring about a new visual order and an associated new way of critiquing modes of visual and social modernity with contemporary impacts. Using the rural South as a backdrop, in Melon Season, Bearden illustrated an intimate scene of Black women's work with clear visual abstraction, incorporating a vivid palette to color his bric-a-brac bodies in a flattened and empty field spotted with floating collaged elements. The seated figure in profile carries a sharp blade in her hand, poised after cutting the pile of greens that rest at the bucket at her feet, or from slicing the watermelon section, resting in the hand of her companion. Intimacy between the two women is reflected in part by their presentation as the sole figures in a bare, albeit colorful, landscape. The isolated ambiance of the environment resonates with the conditions under which Black American women worked in both the 19th century and in today's Black Belt South, practicing quilt making and the food arts, for instance. Shifted from the slave context that preceded them, where abstract communication was necessary to avoid the ears of the masters, Melon Season is a type of politicized space where women voice their various personal and societal challenges to each other while carrying out their tasks. At the same time, Bearden visually transposed the secret communication of spirit writing used by American slaves into a glossolalia, a visual layering of tongues, spiritual messages, or contemporary social narratives in Melon Season that you see here, and other works like it that reference the form of the conjure woman. Bearden's reprise of slave glossolalia is but one way to see his layering strategies. Another way is through the lens of his appropriation of synthetic cubism in a manner he describes eloquently in his 1969 essay entitled Rectangular Structures in My Montage Paintings. Quote, I painted broad areas of color on various thicknesses of rice paper and glued these pieces on canvases, usually in several layers. I tore sections of paper away, always attempting to tear upward and across on the picture plane until some motif engaged me. When this happened, I added more papers and painted additional colored areas to complete the painting, end quote. Bearden used variegated color and the addition of collage materials to heighten his layering and planar dissections in the manner of the synthetic cubists and with the intuitive immediacy of abstract expressionists on the one hand, and on the other, he is conjuring. You're looking at a promotional poster for Bearden's 1964 collage-based Prevalence of Ritual series, and Conjure Woman, a mixed media collage on board from the series. As Rachel Ledoux noted, quote, Bearden's turn to collage in 1963 was accompanied by the appearance of the character of the conjure woman in his work, end quote. A commingling suggesting that the figure was an important formal device Bearden used to push the limits of his particular collage-inflected abstraction. This is the actress Bea Richards as the conjure woman Baby Suggs, as depicted in Jonathan Demme's 1998 filmic adaptation of Toni Morrison's book, Beloved. In 1969, Bearden described the conjure woman as a key figure in Black Southern communities, consulted on matters of love, providing healing protocols, and quelling familial and community conflict. He wrote, much of her knowledge has been passed on through the generations from an African past, although a great deal was learned from American Indians. A conjure woman is greatly feared, and it was believed she could change her appearance. So, in short, Bearden's collage-based abstraction and conjure woman have in common the qualities of simultaneity, showing various planes of vision and existence at the same time, a new visual order, to use Ellison's words, where vision and meaning are accessed through layering that destabilizes notions of linear history and narrative, and, as a parter I might have it, disrupting the center-periphery dynamics upheld by social domination. On the left, we have the 1964 Conjure Woman from the Prevalence of Ritual series, Collage and Mixed Media on Cardboard, and from the same series, Conjure Woman as Angel. Here, and in the next few slides, I'm quickly sharing some of Bearden's Conjure Women as an indexical form of Bearden's collage experiments from 1963, when she first appeared, until about 1975, years immediately preceding and anteceding the year 1967, when he created Melon Season. A particular compositional note in the comparison here is the situation of the women within the painting's fields. On the left, Bearden portraitizes the face of the conjure woman frontally, and in the composition on the right, the standing conjure woman as Angel is captured more in profile. In the Neuberger Melon Season, the figure-field relationships of these respective paintings are layered upon each other, resulting in similar positioning taken on by the two women rendered, and we'll return to this point shortly. This is Romare Bearden's Prevalence of Ritual Tidings, 1964, a collage of various papers with graphite on cardboard. The angel as conjure woman from the previous image is reprised here. In both portrayals, the typical position of the angel Gabriel in most Annunciation paintings from the Italian and Dutch Renaissance and their antecedents were used. Bearden here, as before, conjured the scene as a form of simultaneity rather than a rote derivation of European Renaissance form and narrative, which he in turn intermixed with Southern Black abstraction and vernacular. The visual and conceptual layering of Black vernacular culture and Christian Renaissance portrayals points back to the idea of spirit writing and its slave glossolalia, or visual abstraction. This is Romare Bearden, The Visitor, 1970-1974, watercolor and gouache with ink and graphite on paper. From the previous image to this one, Bearden's formal experimentation translated his conjure woman, created with collage techniques, into watercolor and gouache. So translated from collage to watercolor and gouache. She is an intertextual figure appearing from painting to painting, now in an alternative medium. In addition, the visual composition in which she is placed is the same from the previous conjure woman presentations appropriated from Renaissance Annunciation formats. But Bearden vernaculizes the same scene by entitling it simply The Visitor, and continuing his impulse of formal experimentation in narrative freestyling around the trope of the conjure woman. More mixing of the original formal structure and naming of Prevalence of Ritual Tidings, 1964, continues in these next two works. Here we have an Annunciation of uncertain date, executed in watercolor and collage. And in the next slide, we are viewing a silkscreen entitled Tidings of 1973. This is Bearden's Visitation of 1941. a gouache, ink, and graphite painting on brown paper, obviously next to a 1445 Dutch Renaissance painting by one of Bearden's influences, Roger van der Weyden. And you notice the positions here, and I will get to that in a minute. Let me stick to the script, or I can just go many places. So another instance of conjure woman intertextuality appears in Bearden's Visitation, another instance of conjure woman intertextuality appears in Bearden's Visitation, and what has been called the only self-portrait Bearden painted of himself, which we see here, and here's the Visitation reprised in this only self-portrait, supposedly, of Bearden. This work is a 1981 piece. It's a collage, graphite and mixed media work on fiberboard, which Bearden has titled Profile Part 2, the 30s, Artists with Painting and Model. So within this tableau, the artist references not only the Visitation, but one of his other influences, the early Renaissance master Duccio, right here, by including one of his paintings in the background, just behind and mostly occluded by Bearden's form, among other references and influences within the tableau, from Cubism to African masks, etc. And here, this is just Duccio's Annunciation, 1308, appropriated and made anew with Bearden's Conjure Women sets. Because of Bearden's Conjure Women dynamics of simultaneity and liminality, which, as we've seen, include flipping between Visitation and Annunciation compositional structures, gliding among different media, yet irrespective of media, using layering techniques from collage surfaces to water-based veils, and intertextual references to the conjure woman figure, I read the Neuberger's Melon Season as part of the Conjure Women archive. In this pairing, the figures in Neuberger's Melon Season are positioned according to van der Weyden's Annunciation of 1435. In Bearden's paper collage on canvas work, Gabriel's side profile and the frontality of the Virgin are enacted by the seated and standing women, respectively. A similar move can be seen in earlier Northern Renaissance paintings that Bearden studied, such as Van Eyck's cryptic Arnolfini portrait of 1434. In this case, the angel Gabriel is the Italian merchant Arnolfini, and the woman's identity is up for debate, but commonly taken as Arnolfini's wife. Here, she is in the position of the Virgin Mary in many Annunciation scenes. Moreover, the painting is known by multiple titles: the Arnolfini Wedding, the Arnolfini Marriage, the Arnolfini Double Portrait, and the Portrait of Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife, reminding us of Bearden's lack of precise naming in the Conjure Women formats, depicting the same women and scene, but using different titles: the Annunciation in one and the Visitation in the other, and using different media. This comparison then brings up the question, who is the conjure woman in Melon Season? The conjure woman actually splits both intra-compositionally and inter-compositionally. Whether Bearden layers his Black vernacular scenes featuring women over, under, and or through the Renaissance composition of the Annunciation or the Visitation, it may not matter. From the intra-compositional perspective, both female figures are conjurers and conjured within the scene, representing Christian supernaturalism, adopted by Bearden as fractured, nonlinear, highly abstracted, temporally slippery, slave glossolalia, defined as the encoded visualization or inaction of Black oral text. In the Annunciation, Gabriel is supernatural, an angel, and the Virgin is similarly spiritually imbued as the vessel of Immaculate Conception. In the Visitation, the Virgin is supernaturally impregnated by the Holy Spirit and visits her cousin Elizabeth, who, despite her very advanced age, is 6 months pregnant by God's grace. Formally, the spiritually enervated figure takes the frontal or profile position in those representations, and here, liberally, if not simultaneously. So In the slide on the right, we view another melon season collage of 1967 by Bearden, residing in the Quest Royal Fine Arts Collection in New York City. It is smaller at 11.5 by 8.5 inches. The Neuberger version is 56.5 by 44.5 inches. This is made on cardstock rather than canvas, and it's signed in the lower left, which you cannot find right now, but there's, I think it's here, I think it's actually cut off. It's signed in the lower left side, where Bearden's signature in our work is located in the upper right. So a conjure woman or women appear in both paintings, illustrating the intertextual dynamics that characterize the sense of simultaneity inherent to Bearden's conjure woman forms, and taking us back to Rachel Ledoux's assertion that conjure woman is the indexical marker of Bearden's formal experimentation with collage, achieving a, quote, conjuring, or as Ralph Ellison would have it, bringing, quote, a new visual order into the world, resetting society's clock with his own method of defining the times. So that's the end of my formal presentation, but this is from 1975, another rendition of the Conjure Woman that we see. And again, Bearden's playing with the profile and the frontal nature, and this work is actually entitled, just so you know, The Calabash. So he's also taking some liberties with naming, as hopefully through my talk has been clear as part of the dynamic of what he's doing in these works. And then here you're seeing two more Conjure Women from 1975, different media, and they are called Conjure Women. And the last image I have, again, is a comparison with our work and the original Conjure Woman who appeared in Prevalence of Ritual. And just to show kind of how Bearden has found a place in contemporary visual culture, in May 2014, the Roots' new album cover featured a Bearden work, not a conjure woman, but a male work. And one of the cool things about Melon Season is it invites us to consider the place of women in Bearden's oeuvre, because men are more typically considered. Here we have the great Mickalene Thomas, an awesome painter, born in Newark, lives in Brooklyn, and she's clearly looking at Bearden among other influences, and this is her Marie Femme Noire of 2014, includes mixed media, obviously jewels and heavy collage. And finally, we're looking at Wangechi Mutu's Wangechi Mutu's praying mantra. Wangechi Mutu, of course, born in Kenya, and living and working in Brooklyn, just had a great show at the Brooklyn Museum last year. And she's also looking at some of the shifts and innovations of Bearden's Conjure Women. So thank you.
Thank you. And I want to thank the scholars. Barry's going to come up. But I want to thank all the speakers so much for your contributions to the catalog and for your talks today.
So, I'm going to exercise my privilege to ask one more question of Tracy, because the book is as impressive as it is as a piece of scholarship, which you've seen. I wanted to ask you, what did you learn about Roy you didn't know when you started the book?
What I learned about Roy really is, I mean, it's too big to answer quickly, sure. But just the sheer scope of what he did over time, the influence that he had on really the development of this moment, and the people who were touched by him, who were influenced by him to collect, to make art, whatever it was, is extraordinary in its kind of geometric proportion.
Yeah, and if you haven't seen it, upstairs is his little black book, right?
Yeah, his little black book.
Right, which is a fascinating piece of history in and of itself. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, to imagine that the Pollock that we have now is in that little black book. and he paid $800 for it, right? I mean,
It was a very good investment.
yeah.
Yeah, very good.
So was there a particular talent that was he visionary in essence?
I think so. I mean, he didn't, a lot of collectors at that period of time, they would rely on people to sort of guide them. He just walked you could walk the whole contemporary gallery scene in a day at that time. He bought the Frankenthaler and the Rothko that we have upstairs on the same day, just walking down 57th Street. I mean, he worked at that he loved, and he knew the dealers, and he bought the things he wanted to live with, because remember, these were all things that were in his apartment at one point or time.
Well, the Pollock piece was about helping him pay his...
Yeah, the Pollock was, he walked in, some of you have heard me tell this story, he basically walked into the Betty Parsons Gallery in 1949. He was looking at that painting and left, and he knew Betty Parsons. He had already purchased works from her. Of course, she was one of the great gallerists of that period of time. He went home. She called him later that day and said, and this is before Pollock was Pollock, said, Pollock, he can't pay his oil bill. Will you buy that painting? And he sent the check for $800 off immediately so Pollock could have the money, and didn't even get the painting till the following year.
Well, and certainly Roy Neuberger played a huge role for Purchase College, because Tom and others will know this better than I do. This was the first building, right? Mm-hmm. At the college. And we taught dancing here and everything, right? I mean, this is one of the first buildings that was completed that we were able to use. So it's
You're a child at the time.
I'm not suggesting that Tom was here as president.
Suzanne was here.
Did you teach in this?
No, they didn't let people like me in this building.
But,
We had signs that said trailers. The artists had this building and we had
Right.
trailers. That's all I'm gonna say.
but I think my point is that it's an incredible legacy that we have stewarded. And the more I hang around the museum and learn a lot. Tonight was great, by the way. I mean, it was fantastic. So I want to thank you for your work, Tracy, for putting the book together, your scholarship as well. If I can find a corkscrew, there's more wine, and please hang out.
I want to exercise my prerogative. One story. When Roy was 102, I was at the Armory show then at the Armory, and I'm looking at a piece of art, and behind me I hear the gallery, the dealer say, "Mr. Neuberger, I want to show you the artist that I was talking to you about." And he was in his wheelchair.
Oh, really?
And he was looking at a young artist. I don't know what happened. We talked and said hello, and I moved on. But that was 102.
Well, thank you for coming. It's great to see you guys. Congratulations. It was great.
Thank you.